Please welcome Jeff Solomon, President Emeritus of the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Philanthropies.
Good afternoon, Sally. Thank you. I think you heard from the audience the reactions. Now we're going to try to bring your helicopter down a little bit, become a little closer to our world, with three friends of mine who I'm going to ask to come up and join from three different perspectives. Rabbi JJ Schacter is the University Professor of Jewish History and Jewish Thought and Senior Scholar of the Center for the Jewish Future at Yeshiva University, one of my teachers, for which I'm enormously grateful. Daniel Bonner, Program Officer at the Paul Singer Foundation, member of the board of Columbia University Hillel, and Kathy Manning, former chair of the Jewish Funders of North America, member of the board of JFN, and one of the leaders who has been working on a code of conduct for funders, and hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit. A little perspective. Jewish communities always reflect the host communities they're in. And I'm a big believer that economics drive a lot, and I would commend to you a documentary called Best of Enemies. It followed the Gore Vidal, William Buckley debates at the time of the presidential convention in 1968. Why did it come about? It came about because at that time CBS and ABC and NBC did gavel-to-gavel coverage of conventions. That's the way it had always been done. ABC, the third network, couldn't afford. They were in financial trouble, couldn't afford to do it. So they were just doing a 2-hour cover of the convention, but to entice audiences, they had these two brilliant guys who hated each other for real debate. The audience all went to ABC. It, in many ways, began the gotcha era of television. And we are living through this. We each now have our own news channels. Narrowcasting has become a serious part of the framework that we see, but it's not just narrowcasting. Whether it's CNN, Fox, MSNBC, it's always about people getting angry at each other. It is, if you will, the World Wrestling Federation, except we have a country to run on that basis. And it reminds me of a meeting that some of us had in 1989 with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then a senator from New York, at the time at which Israel was considering changes in the law of return, the who is a Jew controversy. And Moynihan walked into the meeting and he smiled in his very special way and he said, you know, for the first time I've seen the Jewish community agree on something. And we looked at him and he said, this morning a group of Reform rabbis came to me and said, if there's a change in the law of return, please advocate to stop funding of Israel. This afternoon, a group of Orthodox rabbis came to me and said, if the law of return is not changed, please advocate for stopping the support of Israel. He says, the Jews agree, we should stop supporting Israel. So with that as a backdrop, Rabbi Schacter.
That's a heck of a transition. I want to begin by first saying what kind of a privilege I feel for being here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathy, for being responsible for bringing me here, and it's a pleasure to be with you as well. I was thinking about how the issue that we're trying to grapple with, as Andres presented it earlier, is relevant to those of us in this room. And my thoughts went to 1996, when the then Mayor Giuliani of New York City signed what was known informally as the squeegee guy law. This was a law that dealt with quality of life infractions in New York City. And Giuliani essentially made the point that if we deal with small, we'll call them nuisance kinds of crimes, the squeegee guy would jump in front of your car and he would try to clean it or not clean it, and then wouldn't leave until you gave him money. And it was a significant issue. Giuliani suggested if you deal with the smaller issues, then you could deal with the larger issues. And in fact, crime, significant crime, armed robbery and rape and murder actually went down in New York City. The subject that we're grappling with here, and the subject that our community is grappling with, is the nature of the language that we use against one another. The vicious, the toxic, the cruel. The level of discourse is alarming and needs to be addressed. But I want to suggest that the way to focus on that is by first focusing our attention on the less egregious, inappropriate kinds of language, on the sarcastic language, the humiliating language, the disrespectful language, the pejorative language. And it seems to me that here this is relevant to all of us because we're not vicious and we're not mean and we don't say those kinds of things. Other people do. That's not us. But I think if we recognize that in a sense we sometimes can be guilty in engaging in or letting go kinds of language that's not so horrible, but somewhat horrible, then we move from one step to another. And if we could create a climate where any level of inappropriate language is simply not acceptable, and we don't let it go, besides the fact that we don't engage in it, we don't let it go in our conversations, not terrible extreme language, but inappropriate language that we engage in all the time and we're complicit in all the time. If we start there, I think we've got a chance. I want to study briefly a Talmudic text with you. The Talmud tells us in Tractate Eruvin that for 3 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel were arguing with one another. This one says that the law is like me, and this one says that the law is like me. For 3 years, they're at each other. They're absolutely convinced. Each one is convinced that they're right. Yatz'a bat kol va'amra, after 3 years, a heavenly voice comes out and says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim hein. These and these are the words of the living God. Which means, the old story, you're right and you're right. Now, that requires all kinds of an analysis. How could both of them be right? How could okay and not okay simultaneously be right? After all, it would appear to be a zero-sum game. But what interests me is the next 3 words of the Talmudic text. V'halacha kebeit Hillel. It's true that everybody's right. Shammai is right. Hillel is right. But at some point you have to land. The law is like Hillel. Asks the Talmud. I don't understand. If they're right and they're right, why do we follow Hillel? If Shammai is as, quote, right, or as, quote, true, or as, quote, legitimate as Hillel, why do we follow Hillel? And I bring to you a simple phrase in the Talmud. Mipnei shenochin ve'aluvin hayu. Nochin ve'aluvin means because they are easy and forbearing. Because they're nice. They're nice. And they also cite the other opinion. And in fact, concludes the Talmud, they cite the other opinion before they cite their own opinion. It's actually shocking. It's stunningly shocking. I would have imagined, yes, it might be true that both are true, But Hillel somehow is more compelling. He's sharper, he makes a better argument, he's more articulate. There's something about the substance of his position that gives him the benefit. It has nothing to do with the substance of the argument. It has to do with the mode of the argument. And it means to just be nice. It's incredible. Be nice, just be nice. That's all. I feel, in a sense, ridiculous coming from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I need to return this evening back to the East Coast to make a point, but it's not ridiculous at all, to just be nice. And to be nice is relevant to all of us. You know that when we analyze a text, Jeff, I'm going to take another minute. I don't know where we're up to time-wise, but we were given 7, but I have Rahmanas because we're, I think, running a little bit over, so. Okay. We are taught that when we confront a text with what we call a hermeneutic of suspicion. We look at the text, we push back at the text, we challenge the text, we prod the text. We're suspicious of the hold that the text claims to have on us. What I'd like to suggest is that when we confront another human being, we confront that human being with a hermeneutic of human dignity. With a hermeneutic of human dignity, not with a hermeneutic of suspicion. Hillel teaches us, the Talmud teaches us, you just be nice. And it's not very difficult. It's not very difficult. We'll soon have a chance to go around, and each of us will give specific suggestions as to what we think could be. But at this point, I want to leave you with this thought. Both are the words of the living God. Hillel is right, not because Hillel is right. Hillel is right because Hillel operates modeling the hermeneutic of human decency. And that is not relevant only with the big, terrible kind of vitriolic language, but it's the squeegee law. Don't let it get there. Create a culture that doesn't allow us to even get to have that kind of a language. And I think all of us could play a very significant role to move to that direction.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to JFN for this opportunity. It's an honor to get to share some thoughts on the topic of polarization with everybody. I also want to say to Sally, Mazel Tov. It's very exciting to celebrate your bat mitzvah with you, and I think you're a great example. Having watched you on TV, I think a great example of the sort of compassion and empathy, and having been a beneficiary of programs and organizations that Kathy has led, that Jeff has founded, having listened to Rabbi Schacter's classes online for a long time, and Mishi on my morning commute. It's a special privilege to get to be a part of this conversation, and so I just want to say thank you to JFN for that. I think what I'd like to share today is two perspectives, as a representative of a funder and as a young person, and say that polarization is a really bad thing and it's tearing us apart, and then at the same time say, I heard Tal Becker, the Israeli peace negotiator, say the other day that it's not actually a bug in the technological sense, but it's a feature. This sort of strong, the strong opinions on either side in the Jewish community, whatever those sides are, actually make us who we are. And so try to create a sensibility with those two perspectives in mind. And I'm glad, Sally, that you mentioned Trump voters, because I had an opportunity to walk in the shoes of a Trump voter the other day. I clapped for something at the AIPAC Policy Conference, probably one of the 90 or so companies listed on the NASDAQ from Israel. But instead, the next morning, when my boss and colleagues and parents and friends opened up the Wall Street Journal, there was a big picture of me, and it looked like I was clapping for Donald Trump. You don't want to get that call from your mom. or the texts or the emails that I got from others. And it reminded me, I think, of the sense of compassion and empathy that we need to have for everybody, no matter who they decide to vote for. But I think for me, it also reminded me, thinking about today, that our community, as you said, Andres, the Jews are like everybody else, just more so. And I think that really is accurate. And so we have to think about what we can do about it. And I'd like to just suggest a couple of ways for us to do that today. I think most of all what we need to do is to become coalition builders. The funder that I work for, Paul Singer, as many of you know, was a leader in the fight for gay marriage. Paul is also a Republican. And so that effort meant that he needed to partner and work with people that don't see eye to eye with him on many other issues. But I think the lesson from that experience was that social change is hard, and that no great achievement in social change is ever going to sort of be arrived at with just a single group or a single person. And now we're trying to apply those same lessons in the work that we're doing with Israel on campus, which, if you thought the fight for gay marriage was hard, try having a conversation about the various groups that do Israel on campus work. And again, we're thinking about it through the lens of coalition building, through becoming empathetic, compassionate coalition builders, the way that Sally described. Why does it matter? Why do we need to do that, and why do we need to model it for others? I think what happened over the last summer is exactly the reason that we need to become empathetic coalition builders. When I saw my friends look at the front page of the New York Times and see the way that Jews were talking about other Jews and the way that the broader community was talking about it, I was embarrassed, because in some way I'm a part of this community now. And they look to me and say, why are your colleagues, why are your friends talking about others that way? And it's not just because they looked at it and felt alienated by the whole experience. It's because they're actually a part of the solution. When we talk about the Haggadah in a couple of weeks, when the Maggid section begins, where we tell the story of Pesach, 5 sages sit around in Bnei Brak. It could be any of the 5 of you, but only one voice is actually heard to start the conversation, and that's the voice of an unnamed student. And I challenge us to look around the room today. I bet there are more young people here than ever before, but not enough. And I bet there are even fewer college students in the room, and so much of the philanthropy in the room is devoted to them. So for us to think about reaching those audiences and including them in the conversations that we have, I think will actually depolarize the conversation significantly. I want to say, just for 1.5 more minutes, I think, about something about the role of funders. One of the questions I saw in the program booklet earlier was, do funders contribute to polarization? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. That being said, I think everybody contributes to polarization. And what we need to do is think about the practical steps that we can take to be better about the way we communicate with our grantees. I think that's about respect, respect, respect. I think it's about walking in the shoes of the organizations that we work with. Over the last few weeks, some of the organizations that we support have had to make some of the most difficult decisions, I think, in Jewish history. And it's important for us to think about that. That being said, if an organization decides to make a decision that relates to its core mission, and the funder involved says, that doesn't represent my values, I think it's also acceptable for the funder to say, it's time for us to part ways. What's not okay, as Andre said before, is the demonization that happens afterwards. I think we've seen too much of that, and I think it's not just about recognizing it, I think it's about picking up the phone, funder to funder, and saying, stop, this is not acceptable. Demonization of other funders and demonization of organizations. And the last thing I'd say is that I don't ever want this conversation, the conversation about polarization, to become yet another excuse to silence important voices, because you're being polarizing, or its cousin in today's politically correct environment, you've created an unsafe space, too often becomes yet another way to shut down diverse voices in the Jewish community. And so for us to have this conversation today shouldn't be about saying you can't act that way or you can't act that way, but you should act this way and you should act that way. You should cultivate a sensibility of respect and tolerance where strong opinions are valued, because it's not a bug, it's a feature. It actually makes us who we are. We just need to do it with respect for others and a sense that they are human just like us. So with that, hopefully we'll have a minute to talk about practical solutions, but thank you very much, and Kathy.
Okay, thank you. So I think my job sitting here is to talk a little bit about the polarization, the issues that we've discussed from the standpoint of communal organizations. And I'm speaking from the perspective of having been a leader of the Jewish Federations of North America. And for 9 years, I had the privilege of traveling around the country, traveling around the world, and meeting with members of the Jewish community, meeting with Americans, Israelis, lots and lots of students, and hearing how they felt and hearing their concerns. And one of the things I saw over those 9 years was that there was definitely a difference in tone. There was a dramatic increase in the way people felt about being able to voice their opinions on Israel. And I'm going to talk a lot about demonization related to Israel issues. I saw people who were afraid to speak out in the community when their ideas were differed from official positions of the Israeli government. I saw people start to leave the community. I saw young people increasingly feel like they were not welcomed into the community because they weren't willing to toe the line, and they weren't willing to follow the guideline that we'd had for many years, which was we as American Jews should be wholeheartedly supportive of Israel and not express any opinions on their internal policies because we actually don't live there, and so we don't really have a say. I saw people who contributed to programs that built partnerships between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews be demonized for what they were doing. One of our most respected leaders was threatened that her name would be on a bus ad in New York City because she committed the crime of contributing to a well-respected organization that gave money to improve the plight of Israelis who happened to be Arabs. I saw federations when we were discussing about how money should be allocated, which kinds of programs. I saw certain federations shy away from getting involved in any programs that might be considered controversial to some of their donors because they didn't want to lose those donors as contributors. I saw the CEO of Hillel, who had agreed to speak at a J Street conference, be threatened that some of his major funding would disappear if he spoke at that conference. And I can't help but wonder whether his appearing at that conference, which he didn't do, would have actually helped change the views, or at least impact the views of some of those students, the views they held about Israel, the views they held about BDS, the views they hold more and more about being pushed outside of the community. And I can't help but wonder whether we'd be better off if we were talking in a civil way to people who hold different views. I had my own experience with being demonized, not really demonized, but being accused of being disloyal. At the Federation system, we decided that it was time to start expressing the views of the American Jewish community on some of the issues that were cropping up in Israel that were really so anathema to American Jews. And you might remember a time several years ago where over a period of months there were a lot of issues that came up with secular Jews being disenfranchised by things that were happening in the religious community. And there was a feeling among American Jews that it was time for us to express how we felt about this to Israelis, particularly on issues that impact us, like conversion and the ability to marry in Israel. So we consulted with Israelis. We put together a couple of panels, a couple of working groups to talk about how could we speak about these issues with respect to Israelis. What kinds of issues should we be weighing in on in a respectful and loving manner? And at one of the first meetings, I sat in a work group, and the facilitator said, well, let's create a vision statement. Let's talk about what's our mission for this group. And somebody suggested that we say we're working to strengthen the state of Israel. Another group member said, no, I think we should say we're working to strengthen the Zionist enterprise. And I said, I think it would be better for us to say we're working to strengthen the state of Israel, particularly if we're trying to do a broad outreach to young people, because the state of Israel is clear, we understand what we're talking about, and we're not using a phrase that, like it or not, is fraught for some people in our Jewish community, particularly younger Jews. We had a very intense argument over that phrase. And in the end, with the input of some Israelis in our group, we decided we're going to say that we're working to strengthen the state of Israel. A week later, there was an article that appeared in a Jewish weekly that said that the head of JFNA was anti-Zionist, and that she had decided that the word Zionist or Zionism would not appear in any official documents that would come out of JFNA. Needless to say, I was upset. I was upset because it was inaccurate. I was upset that one of the people in this internal confidential committee would go to the press. And I was upset because I had to spend a week answering questions, correcting misperceptions, and making sure that donors weren't walking away because they thought JFNA was an anti-Zionist organization. When it comes, and this was a couple years ago, this was talking about conversion, and this wasn't even talking about settlements or Iran or some of the other issues that have become more fraught and uglier in the last couple years. I recently read a survey that said that 32% of American rabbis won't even talk about Israel from the pulpit because they're too afraid of being attacked by one side or another. So as more and more Jews are choosing to stay outside or to leave the organized community, I have worried more and more about what the outcome will be. Because who will lose is if our community becomes more fragmented. And I believe the answer is we will all lose. Those who depend on the resources that we pull together for food, for medical care, for job retraining, for security needs, all the things that we do together with the money that we raise and spend as a communal community, those who depend on us for help will lose out. But in a sense, all of us will lose out. Because if our Jewish community deteriorates, we lose the joy of working together and celebrating together and making sure that we have a thriving Jewish community in the future. We also lose the power to lobby our federal government to support Israel. And I think that is another thing we have to consider. A Jewish community that's divided is not only bad for the Jews, it's bad, in my opinion, for America, and it's a loss for the world. My eldest daughter put it very succinctly when we were disagreeing about Israeli policies. She was studying for her master's degree at Hebrew University, and she was voicing a lot of dissatisfaction with some of the things that she was seeing in Israel. And my husband sort of stopped her and said, "We don't live here. We really shouldn't be talking about this in this way." She said, "You asked me to love Israel. You asked me to spend my time and money and resources for Israel, but I'm not allowed to have the discussions that the average Israeli has on a regular basis. I feel like that's taxation without representation." So we're running out of time. I'm going to jump to the chase. I saw an article by Arnie Eisen, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, that talked about this exact issue and talked about needing to create the space where we can have these conversations. He said we need to have them with respect. We need to have them with knowledge of the facts, which is sometimes an unusual position to take. And we need to have them with a feeling that we love and support Israel. And we actually pulled together a full-day meeting in New York of leaders from all different walks of life to talk about this issue. And at the end of a very interesting conversation, we agreed that what each of us should do was go back to our own communities and figure out what can we do to impact change? What can we do to enhance or reintroduce civility into the conversation? So the next week or so, I was at a meeting of the JFN Board of Directors. This issue came up, and we decided that maybe what we should do is create some kind of a code of honorable conduct for funders. We have done that. That code of conduct has just been presented to the board. We haven't discussed it yet, but it's a topic for conversation. And it's lengthy, but I think it says a lot of important things about how we as funders behave. Because as funders, we have incredible power to wield, and we have incredible influence. And I'm not so naive to think that just if we pass this code of conduct, everything is going to be solved. But I do think we have to start somewhere. And as it says in Pirkei Avot, it's not our responsibility to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. So I'm hoping that if we in this room try to model the right behavior, if we insist on open and respectful dialogue, if we listen to opposing views and resist from insisting that every organization we work with share our values, share our views up and down the line, I think we'll be setting the right example. And we may not change the entire world, but we may be able to make moderate changes, small steps at a time, that could end up with the community acting in a more civil way toward one another. If we don't set the right example, if we don't try to take these small steps to make sure that our Jewish community can continue to behave as a community, as a family that disagrees but that's still a family, then I leave you with this question. Who will be sitting in this room at this conference 20 years from now? Thank you.
In the 32 seconds we have left, we're going to bring the helicopter down another 10,000 feet. 17 years ago, 25 foundations got together and signed a civility pledge that they would consider the civility of requesting organizations, the leaders of requesting organizations, in making grants. What practical suggestions might you have in terms of funders and foundations? Rabbi?
32 seconds for each of us, or all together 32 seconds?
We'll stretch it out.
We'll stretch it out. I want to go back to the 80s, when the interdenominational conversation in America was reaching a terrible place. Somebody published a book, The Coming Cataclysm. Somebody published an essay, Will There Be a Jewish People by the Year 2000? And the level of discourse was awful. But somehow, it didn't happen. And what was remarkable to me, that in the pre-conference conversation that we had, the issue of denominational tension didn't even come up at all. So the question I ask myself is, why didn't it come up? Why is it, from my perspective, not a real issue, certainly as much as it was, and what can we learn from it? And I think the answer is, first of all, because denominationalism today is not the kind of defining feature of identity as it once was. And I think that is a whole topic of, I think, a great deal of interest, and there are implications for that. But I think also because funders understood that the way to deal with that is by creating safe spaces of face-to-face encounters between people, leaders, and what I want to stress now are future leaders of different denominational perspectives. I have a wonderful blessing, a shout out to the Wexner Foundation. I have a wonderful relationship, and I've learned a lot and hopefully contributed. This foundation, among others, and there are others, who've created places where people get together face to face and really have tremendous differences. But what happens in a room where it's face to face, and actually, Misha, right? Misha? We saw it before. When you presented the radio program of the woman Chaya, it was very moving. When we saw face to face, it was extremely moving. The face-to-face encounter, the video, not just the radio, makes a difference. When you sit in a room as a young woman or man with a leader from another denomination, and you know who they are, and you share experiences, and you go for walks, and you share happinesses and sadness, you can't get up and blast that denomination, regardless of one to the other. It won't happen because you have a face in front of you. You have a sweet face, a warm face, a loving face, a supportive face. There's a person here. You can't talk in generalities when you have a face. My suggestion to try to figure out a way how to bring this into the current iteration of this huge problem, and I like what you said before about let's not just try to make the problem go away, because we really have tremendous passion here, and we have to deal with it, and I like what you said about taking the little steps. These are really, really important, is to create places where leaders on different sides of an issue, major disagreements, can get together, 10 and 10, to talk this out, to model a sensibility, to model a hermeneutic of human dignity, and then to take it on the road and to go to different communities, have personal programs, have larger programs, involve local leaders of communities to model what it means to disagree passionately, but to disagree like a mensch. I think the face-to-face for donors to create consciously, strategically, let's see who are on different sides of the issue. The Iran issue is behind us, but it may not be behind us. The Israel issue is certainly very much relevant, and there are huge debates in our community. Where's there a space where these different perspectives can be hammered out face-to-face, and then work out a model, an ethic, a code of civility that could then be, with funders' help, transported to local communities. I think if we stress this human, personal connection, I think it's a beginning to address the much larger issue that we're facing today.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, I think the three things that we need to do. Number one is to read. If you don't read the Weekly Standard and The Nation, if you don't read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz and Allgemeiner, I didn't really know which two to pick for the Jewish world, I think you're underserved. And your Facebook news feed, by the way, if that's how you get your news, your Twitter feed is not going to give you the news that you need from the other side because it's self-reinforcing. So that's number one, I think, to read as much as possible from all sides. But that's not enough. I think then the face-to-face encounters are important because you need to know, like, and even potentially love the people that you disagree with. And then the last thing I'd say, this art that we need to practice is the art of agreeing to disagree. If we could walk out of this room and call someone up and invite to coffee or Shabbat dinner, someone who has completely disregarded something that we've said, disagreed publicly with something that we've written, someone who sits in some way as an other from where we are, then I think we'll begin, as you said before, to cultivate that sensibility. If we're not actually doing it and rising above some of the tensions, then it will continue to simmer, I think, and we won't really move past where we are.
Thank you.
I think everything's already been said, but not everybody has said it. So let me just say, I think we cannot shy away from the conversations. We need to have the conversations out of a feeling that we are still part of the same community. We need to focus more on the shared values that we have. And I agree, we have to say it's okay to disagree on some of these issues. In terms of what funders do, I think the most important thing you can do, besides deciding that you don't have to agree with everybody up and down the board to do a project with them or to fund them, I think it's important not to tolerate the bad behavior. And I have been in situations where there have been ugly things said about people, and I've seen people sort of laugh at it. And my feeling is that that's just encouraging the bad behavior. I think it's important to say, this is really an inappropriate way to talk about somebody else, and I'm not willing to participate in that kind of discussion. Let's talk about the good things that we can do together.
In your behalf, let me thank the panel for taking on a hard task and doing it well.